Hello again. This is Jim Rawls with the second in a series of presentations to help prepare us for the upcoming pilgrimage to the Holy Land in April of 2013. Our first presentation introduced us to the geography of the Holy Land, what I called getting the lay of the land. We had some fun there comparing the known with the unknown, drawing parallels between the place where most of us reside here in the Golden State with the land to which we'll be traveling, namely the Holy Land. Well, that was fun, but I'm afraid our second topic, beginning here and now, is less likely to be much fun. Not many opportunities to have fun. We'll be dealing with the history of the Holy Land, a tremendously complex subject, one that I'll attempt to simplify without being simplistic. And I should say right off the bat that inevitably this presentation, well, I guess all these presentations for that matter, inevitably it contains mistakes. In spite of my best efforts to get the story straight, and this is an incredibly complicated, conflicted subject, and my goal here is to get it right, but of course, like all human endeavors, one falls short of one's goal. So I ask you here in advance your forgiveness for all my sins of commission as well as omission in presenting this compact history. You do have a fuller account of Holy Land history in the little accompanying booklet that you may already have or you will receive soon. And I invite you, of course, to read that carefully. And also take a look at the bibliography at the end of the booklet for some truly in-depth coverage of what we'll be skimming through here at lightning speed. At the end of our first presentation, I left you with a question which went something like this: being a land sacred to about half the human race, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Now, one might imagine that a land sacred and holy to about half the human race would be a place that has a history of peace and harmony, of goodwill among men, that people who are reverencing the land, be they Christians or Jews or Muslims, that they would also reverence one another, and we would have lots of good fellowship among men and women in that land. But of course, that's not the case by any means. Sadly, it's just the opposite. And indeed, that very sacredness or holiness of the land has contributed mightily to the bloody conflict. We all know this too well. Simply reading the daily headlines, watching the news, we cannot be anything but aware of this continuing conflict in the region. I'm making this recording here in the fall of 2012, and we just passed through another time of an upsurge in conflict in that part of the world with the publication of a film, a video, I guess, that caricatured the Prophet Muhammad, and this led to tremendous rioting and bloodletting and the tragic killing of our ambassador to Libya. And so this political cartoon sort of commenting on that situation to presumably Almighty God there in the clouds, and the news broadcaster says, and now today's report on which religion hates others more on your behalf. And then down at the bottom you see the little character saying, heaven help us. Well, the title and the theme of this history presentation is Conflicted, Conquered, and Contested, which sounds a lot like bewitched, bothered, and bewildered, I suppose, and that could also be a decent topic, a decent title for a history of the Holy Land. Indeed, it is hard to imagine any place on planet Earth that is more conflicted, has been more conquered, and more contested than these sacred precincts we call the Holy Land. Well, we begin our story, of course, at the beginning, with the arrival of the first people into what becomes the Holy Land. And these people, our ancient ancestors, all of our ancient ancestors, we believe, came out of Africa at some point in the distant mists of time. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, people came out of Africa and settled in the area that is the Holy Land. We know for certain, because we have archaeological evidence, we can do carbon-14 dating and so on human remains and other evidences of human occupation. We have fairly good documentation on a group of people who arrived about 20,000 years ago. These were, of course, Stone Age people, Paleolithic people. And when they arrived in the Holy Land, they brought with them a remarkable toolkit of stone implements, grinding tools, stone spear points, stone arrow points, of course, for hunting. But those weapons of hunting were also used as weapons of war. We know this from the embedded arrow points in skulls and that sort of thing that give us pretty clear idea that our ancient ancestors, all around the world for that matter, did engage in conflict. Nothing new there. The oldest inhabited city in the world is in the heart of the Holy Land. It's the city of Jericho, which we will be visiting on our pilgrimage, and just this year, rather arbitrarily, I think, decided to celebrate its antiquity by declaring that this is the 10,000th anniversary of the founding of Jericho. It may have actually been founded more like 12,000 years ago. We're not really sure, but we do know that this has the remains here are clear evidence of the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Archaeologists have determined that here there are the earliest, or some of the earliest city walls known to man, the earliest steps constructed by our human ancestors. Archaeologists have indeed, in going through the tell or the mound at ancient Jericho, have uncovered some 23 different civilizations that have risen and fallen in just this one area. And I'm sure you would love to know the names of all 23 civilizations, but hey, you're not going to get that information from me. What I will tell you is that one of those civilizations, namely the Canaanites, is a civilization that you already know something about if you've read your Bible. In the Old Testament, there are some 160 different references to the land of Canaan or the Canaanites who once occupied this land, going back to the Bronze Age, around 4th century BC. And the Bible even describes the boundaries of the land of Canaan, including modern-day Lebanon and parts of Jordan, as well as Israel and the Palestinian territories. This was the flourishing, complex civilization that inhabited this land prior to the arrival of Abraham and his people. According to the biblical record, Abraham, the father of the three great Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, it was Abraham, estimated around the year 2000 BC, received a revelation from God down in Ur of the Chaldees, which is in modern-day Iraq on the Euphrates River. And according to Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord appeared to Abraham and commanded him, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." And old Father Abraham and his families traveled northwestward up to Haran, which is in modern-day Turkey, and then turning southwestward, they moved on down into the land of Canaan. This was the land promised to Abraham and his people by God. It was in Jerusalem, what became later Jerusalem, it was then a Canaanite city, Jebus, that Abraham obeyed God's command to go up on a mountaintop and there to sacrifice his son Isaac as a sign of his total obedience to the dictates of the Creator God. But of course, you know from your Bible studies that Abraham's hand was stayed by God or a messenger from God, and his son Isaac was spared. What you may not know, however, is that that biblical story is traditionally identified with the place in Jerusalem that we're going to be visiting, Temple Mount, where a great Dome of the Rock stands today. That is the site, by tradition, where Abraham was to sacrifice his son Isaac. It was Isaac's son Jacob who, again, according to the biblical record, wrestled with God or God's messenger, and whose name was then changed from Jacob to Israel, which means he who struggles with God or he who wrestles with God. And it was Jacob's 12 sons, the 12 grandsons of old Father Abraham, who became the ancestors of the Israelites, known also as the 12 tribes of Israel or the children of Israel. And these three great generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are the great patriarchs of the Old Testament. It was through them that God made a covenant with the chosen people of Israel to inhabit the land of the Canaanites, that they would possess it, they were to develop it, and in exchange for that gift from God, the people of Israel, the children of Israel, were to remain faithful to God. This is from Psalm 105. It's very clear. The covenant God made with Abraham, the oath that he swore to Isaac, which he established as a statute for Jacob, there's those three generations, an everlasting covenant for Israel, saying, to you will I give the land of Canaan to be your allotted inheritance. Well, again, continuing from the biblical account, we know that a famine struck the land of Canaan, devastating the crops there, and the children of Israel migrated southwestward on down into the fertile lands of Egypt, where they remained for some 4 generations. And again, according to the biblical record, it was there that the children of Israel were enslaved by the Egyptians until a mighty leader was called forth by God, that of course being Moses, and God commanded Moses to lead his country, here I'm quoting from Exodus chapter 3, verse 8, to lead his people into a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites. And so Moses, in response to God's command, as you recall, from film as well as text, Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula, fleeing the Egyptian armies across the Red Sea, receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, and then wandering around in the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula for some 40 years, until reaching the edge of the land of Canaan, where Moses dies. But the people of Israel continue on into what they regarded as their promised land. Following the Exodus back into the land of Canaan, the Bible recounts an ongoing armed struggle between the Israelites and their Canaanite neighbors. Remember, the Canaanites were the indigenous population there prior to the arrival of Abraham, prior to the arrival of the people following Moses. So the Israelites are fighting the Canaanites for control of the land, but they're also fighting another relatively recently arrived, contemporary with Abraham's arrival, another group in that land, the so-called Philistines, who were a seagoing people who had carved out an enclave along the southern coast of Israel, which is really around where the Gaza Strip is located today. And their little enclave was known as Philistia, and thus the Philistines were the people who lived there, and the Israelites were fighting both Canaanites and Philistines, according to the biblical account, to continue to have control or to extend their control over the land that God had promised to them. It was perhaps due to military necessity that the 12 tribes of Israel, around the year 1000, coalesced under their first monarch, which would, of course, be the great King Saul. King Saul, the first king of Israel, and he ruled over the United Kingdom of all of these 12 tribes of Israel. His successor, David, is familiar to us, of course, as the second king of Israel, and the guy who defeated the big giant, what's his name, in the battle, David and Goliath, there it is, and also is the legendary songwriter of many of the Psalms. And it was David who led the battle capturing Jerusalem, what became the city of Jerusalem, from the Canaanites. Major victory. It was then David's son Solomon, another great king, the third king, who built the first grand temple on Temple Mount, which you recall again was the traditional location for Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac, and it was there that David locates the great temple. Within that great temple was the Holy of Holies. Within that was the Ark of the Covenant. And within that, of course, were the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Pardon me, and if ever there was a golden age for these ancient Israelites, I think this was that time, with the construction of this incredibly beautiful, according to the biblical account, temple for the worship of God. I say that was perhaps the golden age for the ancient Israelites because following Solomon's death around 930 BC, things began to fall apart in the so-called divided kingdom period. 10 of the 12 tribes seceded to form the northern kingdom of Israel with Samaria as its capital, and two tribes remaining loyal to the house of David formed the kingdom of Judah. Those two tribes in the south were the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And in the rival kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem was the capital, facing the kingdom of Israel in the north, again with Samaria as its capital. The name Judah, of course, continues on into our own vocabulary because it is from the word Judah, based on the tribe of Judah, that we have the word Jew. Being divided between Judah and Israel, the children of Israel were ripe for conquest. They were weakened by being divided. And indeed, soon after the time of Solomon, we began to see a weakening. We begin to see rival empires arising all around and threatening the integrity of the children of Israel, of the Israelites, of Judah and Israel. The conquests came soon enough, and there were 5 in number between the time of Solomon and the time of Christ. 5 different conquests swept over the Holy Land. And it's important when we consider those multiple conquests, which we'll be getting to in just a second, we have to remember that these conquests are interpreted in the biblical account as having a very important theological meaning. You recall the covenant that God had established with the children of Israel was, if you remain faithful to me, I will give you this promised land. Well, the problem was, from the biblical account, from the theological perspective, the children of Israel did not remain loyal and faithful to God. They did follow other gods. They did go astray. They did become unfaithful. And thus, again, according to the biblical account, because of that, the land was taken from them in these multiple invasions and conquests. And God and the prophets, through the prophets, is continually calling the people to come back to faithfulness. In 2 Chronicles, we have these words, if my people, God says, who are called by my name, humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Well, the first of those 5 conquests between the time of Solomon and the time of Christ came in the mid-700s with the rise of the empire of Assyria, which was located in what is today northern Iraq. And it was in the year 720 that the Assyrian forces extended their imperial control down to the Mediterranean, capturing the northern kingdom of Israel and defeating Philistia as well. And these Assyrian conquerors sent into exile the people from the northern kingdom of Israel. These 10 tribes become known in legend and lore as the lost tribes of Israel, the lost 10 tribes of Israel. The Assyrians also later moved south and besieged Jerusalem and ruled the southern kingdom of Judah as well as a vassal state. Conquest number 2 from Babylon in the late 500s. The Assyrian Empire eventually was eclipsed by another rising empire with expansionist tendencies, namely Babylon, which was originally a city-state to the south of modern-day Baghdad, once again in Iraq. In 587, the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians, the Babylonians being led by King Nebuchadnezzar, familiar name, who captured Jerusalem in the year 587 and destroyed utterly Solomon's grand temple and sent into exile now many of Judah's people as well. In other words, the people of the southern kingdom of Judah are also now being conquered, in this case by the Babylonians, and being sent off into exile as well. You may be familiar with the term the Babylonian captivity. These are the some 70 years, many decades, during which the people of Judah were in exile in Babylon. This was a very important period in the literature of the Hebrew Bible. Many of our Old Testament most familiar writings come from this exilic literature, this exilic time when the people are in exile. The books of Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and many other portions of the Old Testament are written by the people of Judah residing in captivity in Babylon. But of course, Babylon, the conqueror of the conquerors, was itself soon conquered. Which brings us to conquest number 3, Persia. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, coming out of modern-day Iran, defeated the Babylonians in 538 and permitted the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to their homeland. And according to the biblical record, some 50,000 Jews returned to Judah and set about building the second temple in Jerusalem. And this ushers in what in biblical history is called the Second Temple period. And indeed, the history of the Jews, the Second Temple period is very important. These returning people from exile found themselves in conflict with the people from the north who had remained, who had not been sent into exile, some of them, and some of the remnants of the southern tribes and the northern tribes centered in Samaria. Those who had remained behind, who had not gone into exile, had been assimilated into alien culture, and the Jews returning from exile found themselves in conflict with their more assimilated brothers and sisters and cousins. And it was that distrust between the Samaritans or the Samaritans and the Jews that forms the background to the conflict or problems during the time of Jesus as well between Jews and Samaritans, which you recall, of course, from the New Testament accounts. The fourth conquest came from Greece in the mid-300s. In the year 333 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, bringing the Holy Land into the Greco-Roman orbit. And the people who were living in the Holy Land were now faced with another alien culture, and many of the Jews who were living there did assimilate into that Greco-Roman world. They became Hellenized, taking up the Greek language, for example, and Greek ways. Some resisted, some accommodated themselves to this new regime. The rule by Alexander was followed by a series of rival factions following his death, various dynasties ruling in the empire established by Alexander the Great. And as time went on, the pressure to the conquered peoples of Israel to conform to those Hellenic Greco-Roman ways increased. And eventually we enter into a time of really enforced assimilation by some of these ruling dynasties, forbidding the Jews from many of their ritual practices, including outlawing of circumcision, The worship of Zeus became, shall we say, a state religion and was imposed, even placing an idol of the Olympian god Zeus on the temple altar there in the Holy of Holies. Not surprising, the Israelites, shall we say, the children of Israel, revolted against this heavy-handed rule by this outside dynasty. In the mid-100s BC, the Jews revolted in the revolt of the Maccabees. The word Maccabee comes from the Hebrew word for hammer, and moving later into Greek and Latin, our word machete, for example, has the same origin here. The Maccabees, the hammer people. Using guerrilla tactics, the Maccabean forces defeated the ruling dynasty, established independence for Israel, intimidated the Hellenized Jews, those who had become more assimilated to the Greco-Roman ways, and recaptured Jerusalem. With the recapturing of Jerusalem, the Maccabees were determined and followed through with their determination to rededicate the temple, sweeping out any of the pagan idols that had been placed there and rededicating it to the worship of God. The Jewish festival of Hanukkah, as you probably know, celebrates that rededication of the temple following the victory of the Maccabees in the mid-100s BC. And so for several decades there, from around 145 to 63 BC, the children of Israel enjoyed a break, a breather, a welcome time of independence. But of course, that independence also was short-lived with the arrival of conquest number 5. And that conquest, of course, was the greatest of all. I was using the term Greco-Roman earlier, and of course, this is the Roman part of that imposition of alien culture. In the year 63 BC, the great Roman general Pompey laid siege to Jerusalem and captured it for the Empire of Rome. The historian Josephus recounts Pompey's lopsided victory with these words: "Of the Jews there fell 12,000, but of the Romans very few." Rome renamed the conquered province, formerly Judah and Israel. They renamed that whole area Judea, a name which we recognize from the birth narratives of Jesus. You recall in St. Matthew's Gospel that Jesus was born, quote, "In the time of King Herod, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea." For a time, the conquerors from Rome chose to rule the region through a dynasty of Jewish Roman client kings. Herod the Great, founder of that ruling dynasty, was declared by Rome to be King of the Jews. And it was this Herod, of course, who was ruling at the time of the birth of Christ, according to the biblical account. And it was Herod who also, perhaps more famous in his own time, was the reason for a tremendously ambitious program of public works, many of which, the remains of which, are still visible today in Israel. Along the coast of Judea, King Herod founded the port city of Caesarea, which became a key Roman administrative center. And in the interior, he built a couple of fortress complexes and palaces, one at Herodion, which recently, within the last 10 years, I think it was, has been identified for sure as the burial place of King Herod. And also Masada was built by Herod, which became a great isolated palace fortress, and that will enter into our story again at a later point. But Herod's greatest achievement in this program of public works was the enlargement and rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Herod's engineers designed massive walls that you see illustrated here in this reconstruction, massive walls to be built around a natural hill, creating this expansive platform of what today we call Temple Mount, which allowed for the enlargement of the religious buildings and structures and ritual activities on this enormous platform. The western wall of that platform still stands today. It is called the Western Wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall. That's a remnant of these enormous retaining walls from 1st century BC King Herod's time. And this site is regarded as the holiest site in all of Judaism, where Jews, of course, today go and pray on a regular basis. And when we visit that site, we will observe that very sacredness for ourselves. When the temple was completed, and the Temple Mount platform was completed, this enormous structure was perhaps the largest religious structure ever built. And it was the temple that stood again during the time of Jesus. As Roman rule continued, the pressure for assimilation once again accelerated. The Roman rule became more heavy-handed. When the mad Emperor Caligula, convinced of his own divinity, attempted to have his image placed in the Holy of Holies, in the temple at Jerusalem, the Jews rebelled once again. This in the year 66 AD. This Jewish revolt, however, was not successful. The Roman legions crushed it. They retook Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, set the temple ablaze, destroying utterly that second temple that had been so expanded by King Herod. Again, according to the historian Josephus, he has this account. When the flames rose up from the burning temple, the Jews let out a terrific cry, and heedless of mortal danger, ran to put it out. But their efforts failed, the rebellion failed, the Romans defeated the Jews, they razed the Jewish temple to the ground, carrying off in triumph whatever treasures they could find. If you visit Rome and look carefully on the Arch of Titus, not too far from the Colosseum, you can still see there, 2,000 years later, in bas-relief, the carved scenes of the utter destruction and despoliation of the temple in Jerusalem. The Jewish rebels made their last desperate stand against the forces of Rome at the mountain fortress of Masada that had been built by King Herod. And when we visit that site, it's quite astounding to see still the remains of the Roman camp down below, the Jewish stronghold rebel fortress up on top, and this Roman siege ramp that the Roman soldiers used eventually to capture Masada and to put an end to the rebellion. Once again, however, Jewish resistance to Rome flared a generation or two later. This was during the time of Emperor Hadrian in the early 130s AD. And Emperor Hadrian felt, that's enough is enough, and he launched a campaign of even stronger repression against the Jews of the Holy Land. He changed the name of the province from Judea to Syria Palestina, after the coastal enclave of the Philistines, and thus the origin of the name Palestine, by which this land continued to be known all the way up until the mid-20th century. Emperor Hadrian destroyed hundreds of Jewish villages throughout the Holy Land, ordered the execution of many Jewish leaders in his attempt to establish unchallenged Roman authority. Hadrian ordered Jerusalem to be rebuilt as a Roman town, which he renamed Aelia Capitolina, formerly Jerusalem, now taking on a Roman name. And Jews, to add insult to injury, Jews were banned from entering their former capital city by Emperor Hadrian. Many Jews were enslaved and transported to Rome, Others fled to Egypt, North Africa, and Babylon, leaving their homeland, part of the diaspora, the dispersed people, the dispersed Jewish people from Israel. With Rome now expanded to its ultimate limits, the Romans, of course, as all empires and imperial people, the Romans believed that their rule would be unending. But of course, we, with the advantage of the hindsight of history, know that that was not to be by any means. Rome was experiencing internal decay. Rome was experiencing threats from northern barbarians, so-called barbarians, which were eroding the empire's vitality. It was in the early 4th century that the Emperor Constantine decided that it was necessary to relocate the imperial capital from threatened Rome eastward to Byzantium, which became the new capital of the Roman Empire. Byzantium, which later became known as Constantinople, and more recently, of course, as Istanbul. And it was under Constantine the Great, ruling now from Byzantium, that Christianity achieved legal sanction throughout the Roman Empire and later became the official religion of the empire. And you may know the story of Constantine's Christian mother, Helena, who has a huge impact on the Holy Land. In the year 326 AD, Constantine's mother, Helena, traveled to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage, and there she identified a number of sites as being key places in the history of the life of Christ, including the birthplace of Christ in Bethlehem and the place of the crucifixion and burial and resurrection in Jerusalem. She also identified and collected and built basilicas and churches for their preservation, a number of relics, including pieces of the true cross. The slow decline of the Western Roman Empire culminated in 476 when the last emperor in Rome was deposed by a Germanic chieftain, and we then enter fully into the Byzantium or Byzantine period of rule. Constantine, ruling from the east, continued to hold sway over the Holy Land for some 2 centuries. Not Constantine personally, of course, but the Byzantium successor emperors ruling from that city. Thousands of Christian pilgrims followed in the footsteps of Helena into the Holy Land, retracing the life of Christ. Leaders of the Orthodox Church, centered there in the East, identified and commemorated many different holy sites related to the life of Christ. And indeed, when one visits the Holy Land, one is certainly struck by the presence of the Orthodox Church, and many of the churches that we'll be visiting on pilgrimage indeed are Orthodox and have portions of those buildings that are under the aegis of the Orthodox, one of the Orthodox churches. It was under Byzantine rule that Jews were permitted once again to enter the city of Jerusalem, no longer banned, as back in the early days of Hadrian's rule. The proportion of the area became steadily more Jewish, but the Jews remained a minority. It was on the eve of the next cataclysmic conquest of the Holy Land. This gentleman appears on the scene, and of course this is the Prophet Muhammad. At the time of Muhammad's birth in the 7th century AD, the majority population of the Holy Land was Christian, with a Jewish minority, but that would soon change with the advent of Islam. Perhaps you are surprised to learn that Jerusalem is one of the 3 holiest cities of Islam. Mecca is the holiest city, the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. Medina, also in Saudi Arabia, is the place of his burial. And Jerusalem is the 3rd holiest site in Islam because this is the site of the Prophet's mystical night journey. This night journey of the Prophet Muhammad is one of Islam's foundational events. It's a spiritual and physical passage which occurred on a single night around the year 621. According to tradition, Muhammad rode his faithful steed Buraq from Mecca to Jerusalem and there ascended into the heavens to receive instructions from Allah to deliver to his followers. The night journey of the Prophet Muhammad from Jerusalem to the heavens. Within a couple of decades of that fateful ride, Muslims controlled not only Mecca and Medina, but also Jerusalem. Sweeping out from the Arabian Peninsula, Muslim Arabs defeated the Byzantines, conquered Palestine in the late 630s, and gradually Islam replaced Christianity and Judaism as the dominant religion. And Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land was thoroughly Islamicized in these decades of the 600s and into the 700s. Atop the sacred platform, which Muslims refer to it as the sacred platform. Christians and Jews refer to it as Temple Mount. It was there in the year 691 that Muslims built the Dome of the Rock, enshrining the site where Muhammad had ascended heavenward during his night journey. It's a magnificent building, truly one of the most beautiful, most geometrically perfect buildings ever constructed. The interior of the building looks like this, and there in the Dome of the Rock is the rock, which, again, according to tradition, is the site of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. It is, by tradition, the site of the Holy of Holies containing the Ten Commandments, and by tradition, it is also the place where the Prophet Muhammad had ridden on his night journey heavenward. During the centuries of Muslim sovereignty, the Holy Land was ruled by a series of caliphates, which are administrative centers. There were three main ones in Baghdad, Damascus, and Medina. And over the centuries of Muslim rule, as in previous conquests, there were varying degrees of pressure to assimilate, varying degrees of toleration for people of other faiths to practice their religion. The Jews and Christians who, during times of toleration, were allowed to reside in Jerusalem were there at Muslim permission, but were subject to an infidel tax. So they were discriminated against in that way. A more repressive regime among the Muslim rulers of the Holy Land began in the year 1071, when the Seljuk Turks took over Jerusalem and denied Christians access to the city. It was that particular rule that, of course, stimulated the Europeans now to launch the Crusade. These tragic events that we call the true Crusades, that went on for a couple of centuries, were a series of organized, quasi-religious military campaigns coming out of various places of Europe over the years, marching to the Holy Land, to the land of Jesus, which, as you see on this map, at that time was being ruled by these Seljuk Turks, Muslim rulers of the Holy Land. Several 100,000 soldiers became crusaders in Europe by taking religious vows and wearing the emblem of the cross. The term crusade comes from the Latin word for cross, which is crux, C-R-U-X. From crux, meaning cross, comes the word crusade. The crusaders always wearing the cross, carrying the banner of Christ over them on flags and other emblems. Along the way, as the Crusaders headed towards the Holy Land, these Christian armies slaughtered thousands of European Jews, whom they condemned as Christ killers. And once in the Holy Land, the Crusaders massacred Muslims, Jews, and even Christianized Arabs. The Crusaders captured the holy city of Jerusalem in 1099 and held it for nearly a century, carving up the surrounding territories into principalities known as Crusader states. Christian military organizations such as the Knights Templar gained tremendous power and wealth in these Crusader states. The Knights Templar, you may be familiar with that group from, again, film and novel. They bear the name Templar because of their headquarters there in the temple up on Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem. And again, not surprising, with Christian rule in the Holy Land, the Muslim population resented that rule from these Europeans from the outside and launched a resistance campaign against the Crusaders. One of the great leaders of that resistance movement was the Kurdish Sultan Saladin. He was perhaps the most effective in the Muslim reconquest of the Holy Land, defeating eventually the Crusader forces throughout the region and retaking Jerusalem in the year 1187, which means Jerusalem was under Christian rule for a little less than a full century. Saladin was admired for his tactical skill and also got some grudging admiration for some of his acts of chivalrous restraint, at least so commented one of England's crusaders, Richard the Lionheart. Eventually, only a single Crusader state remained under Christian control on the northern coast at a town called Acre, until it also was finally captured in the year 1291. So all told, the Crusader interregnum during Muslim rule lasted about 200 years, from the capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099 until the fall of Acre in the 1290s. Among the Muslim forces arrayed against the Crusaders during this time of conflict, there was a very interesting group that I had never heard of before, the Mamluks. Perhaps you're familiar with them. A fascinating group. These were originally prisoners of Genghis Khan. They were Muslims, of course. And these Mamluks had been sold from Genghis Khan into slavery in Egypt, where they eventually rose to power, seized power, and then became conquerors themselves, coming back out of Egypt into the Holy Land. These Egyptian-based Muslim Mamluks conquered Palestine in the mid-1200s and remained in control of the Holy Land until the early 1500s. During these years of Mamluk dominance, corresponding roughly to Europe's, late Middle Ages, Jerusalem's defensive walls were dismantled. Much of the surrounding area declined into a sort of neglected backwater, and this was perhaps one of the lowest points in the history of the Holy Land. These Mamluk overlords converted many of the Christian churches back into mosques, and forbade Jews from worshiping at the sacred sites. Well, meanwhile, while the Jews were having a harder time in the Holy Land under Mamluk Muslim rule, the Jews also were facing hard times back in Western Europe, where they had fled during the time of persecution there. Now they are facing also persecution in Western Europe. Indeed, as perhaps you know, perhaps you don't know, the countries of Western Europe expelled the Jews in the Middle Ages, banned them from living there. For example, from England in the year 1290, Jews were expelled. Later, you're probably familiar with the expulsion from Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1497, France in between those years, between the time of the expulsion from England and from Spain. And this led to further dispersion of the Jewish diaspora, which had come out of the Middle East, fled into Western Europe, now being persecuted in Western Europe, fleeing into Eastern Europe, into North Africa, and into what became the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire. one of the largest and longest lasting empires in history, but one that we frankly don't think much about anymore. But think about it now. For 400 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled the Holy Land. And at first, in the 16th century, this ushered in a time of renewed prosperity and relative prominence for that area. Jews were encouraged and continued to return to the region, fleeing a safer haven there than in Western Europe. Christians continued to come into the Ottoman-controlled Holy Land on pilgrimages, establishing, in some cases, new churches within that territory. One of the great leaders, probably the greatest leader of the Ottoman Turks, was the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Under his rule, the walls that we still see today around the old city of Jerusalem were built. They come from the 16th century, from the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. These massive stone walls, about 40 feet high and 8 feet thick, encircled the entire perimeter of the old city of Jerusalem. And within those walls and within the Holy Land, trade and commerce flourished under what was initially fairly effective and efficient Ottoman rule. There was a cultural renaissance in the area. Things were looking good. But again, how many times have you heard this? This was to change. Things were not to remain the same. And a steady decline set in from around the mid-16th century onward, and the Holy Land began to deteriorate, shall we say, physically and culturally and economically. You may remember the term from your history books, the sick man of Europe. The sick man of Europe refers to Ottoman control of much of Europe, as well as North Africa, as well as the Middle East, and the weakness of the Ottoman Empire as time went on stimulated, shall we say, the cupidity of rival European powers. In the late 1700s, Napoleon of France invaded the coastal region of Palestine. Other European nations also launched incursions along the perimeter of the Ottoman Empire. There was growing European influence within the bounds of the within the bounds of the Ottoman Empire. Within the Holy Land, rivalries for guardianship of some of Christianity's sacred sites there contributed to the Crimean War in the 1850s between Britain and Russia. And this is a monument you're looking at here to the Crimean War on Lower Regent Street, just below Piccadilly Circus in London. That war between England and Russia, the so-called Crimean War, was sparked, among other things, by the alleged theft of a silver star marking the birthplace of the Prince of Peace in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Isn't that amazing? And I think when we go to Bethlehem, we will see that very silver star. Well, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were also a time of heightened persecution of European Jews, those Jews who had fled from the West into the East. In Tsarist Russia and throughout Eastern Europe, anti-Jewish pogroms routinely ravished Jewish homes and businesses, killing untold numbers of Jews. Jews, having been expelled from Western Europe, were now facing increased persecution in Eastern Europe. And as a consequence of that, Jewish migration to the Holy Land under Ottoman rule accelerated. By the end of the 19th century, by, let's say, the year 1900, about a tenth of the population of Palestine was Jewish. And actually, a majority of the population in the city of Jerusalem was Jewish. And it was at this time, around 1900, that a new force appears within Judaism. And that new force, of course, was Zionism. Outspoken Jewish leaders, such as the Hungarian-born Theodor Herzl, began calling for political action to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. The term Zionism was coined to sum up that political campaign to establish a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine. And Jews around the world were encouraged and took up the rallying cry of Zionism to find a permanent homeland for themselves. It's important to note, however, that not all Zionists believe that Palestine was the best location for a future Jewish state. Some Zionists advocated a Jewish homeland in sparsely settled areas of Canada, Australia, Uganda, or even the Mexican peninsula of Baja California. Did you know that? Several prominent Jews in Southern California were among those in a minority group within Zionism who were advocating a Jewish homeland and refuge in Baja California. They approached the Mexican government in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the Mexican authorities said, it sounds good to us, and there was actually a real possibility that the Jewish homeland might have been located there in Baja California. One of those who was advocating such a location was a fellow by the name of Israel Zangwill, who was a British Zionist of Russian descent and was sympathetic to that notion of a Baja Jewish homeland. But of course, that minority position was a minority. The majority view was, and Zangwill eventually went over to that side, that Palestine is the most logical place. In the year 1901, Israel Zangwill, this British Zionist of Russian descent, wrote these fateful words: Palestine is a country without a people. The Jews are a people without a country. This sentiment, originally penned by Israel Zangwill, was later popularized with the slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land." That became the rallying cry for Zionists around the world. A land without a people for a people without a land. But that slogan, as catchy as it may be, ignored just a bit the biblical and historical record of the land, which certainly had a people, and this sentiment augured a future of continued conflict, as we only know so well. In the early years of the 20th century, we experienced, of course, the Great War, World War I, which set in motion forces that shaped much of the subsequent history of the 20th century and indeed the 21st century. And it's difficult, I think, to overstate the importance of that horrific conflagration. And I mean impact worldwide, I mean impact specifically on the Holy Land. In the lineup of opposing forces in the First World War, you have the Ottoman Empire aligned with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, usually referred to as the Axis powers. And on the other side, the Allied powers, including Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States. The Allies, certain of their eventual victory, during the war laid plans to divide up the defeated Axis countries among themselves. I don't mean all of their countries, but many of their territories that were controlled worldwide by these Axis empires were being now eyed for takeover by the Allied victors. But at the same time, during the war, the Allies encouraged Arab and Jewish demands for post-war independence in the old Ottoman Empire in exchange for their aid, for Arab aid, for Jewish aid in defeating the Ottoman Turks. In 1916, the Arabs in the Middle East launched a revolt against Ottoman Turkish rule and were aided by the British, most notably by the dashing Colonel T.E. Lawrence, who gained international fame as Lawrence of Arabia. So here the British are supporting Arab demands or Arab sentiment for independence once the Ottoman Turks are defeated. At the very same time, the British were seeking Jewish support for the war against the Ottoman Turks, and issued in 1917 the famous Balfour Declaration, endorsing the creation of a national Jewish home in Palestine, endorsing, in other words, the Zionist hope for a Jewish state in Palestine. In 1917, not only was the Balfour Declaration issued, but also the British captured Jerusalem. Under General Edmund Allenby, the Ottoman Turks were defeated in 1917 in both Palestine and in Syria, and Jerusalem was captured, and General Allenby rode victoriously through the streets of Jerusalem. And at the end of the war, the British then were in something of a pickle. They had encouraged Arab demands for independence. They had encouraged Jewish demands for independence. But they also had their own interests of controlling land in the conquered territories of the defeated Axis powers. What to do? Well, at the war's end, the League of Nations, formed by the victorious Allied nations, placed certain territories of the defeated Axis countries under the administration of, again, various Allied victors. These new administrative units were called mandated territories. The disassembling, the deconstruction of the Ottoman Empire left Great Britain, England, with mandated control of what became Iraq as well as Palestine. France, another one of the victors in the war, received mandated control for Syria and Lebanon, all promising these areas eventual independence, but now ruled by the mandated powers like colonial powers. At first, the British mandate was a single unit, Palestine, but in the 1920s it was divided more or less along the Jordan River. The area then to the west became known as Palestine, and the area to the east of the river became known as Transjordan. During the years of British mandate rule, from the end of the First World War until the end of the Second World War, during those years of British mandate rule, Jewish immigration to Palestine dramatically increased. Consider this, in 1920, the population of Palestine included some 500,000 Arabs, by far the majority population, and 85,000 Jews, relatively small minority. But during the next 20 years, 250,000 Jews arrived in British Mandate Palestine, many of them fleeing the specter of Nazi persecution throughout Europe. They had a good reason to leave, and they had a good country they believed to go to. The population, in other words, the Jewish population of Palestine, 1920 was about 85,000. By 1940, the beginning of the First World War, the Jewish population had increased from 85,000 to 335,000. Still a minority, but approaching the number of Arabs in that land. Palestinian Arabs living in their homeland resented the growing Jewish immigration and the growing Jewish acquisition of lands in Palestine. And the Palestinian Arabs launched an attack on Jewish settlements. They began a full-scale revolt against British control, saying we had been promised our independence, we want our independence now, and we want it to be an Arab state. We want to have restrictions placed on the number of Jews who are continuing to come into our homeland. Well, hoping to placate Arab opposition, the British government issued a series of measures, so-called white papers, to restrict further Jewish immigration. And these immigration restrictions by the British government on Jews coming in to British mandated Palestine, those restrictions only intensified as persecution of the Jews under Nazi rule in Europe continued. So on the eve of World War II in 1939, well, this is the beginning of the war does begin in Europe, of course, in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. It was in 1939 that Britain issued its final immigration restrictive mandate, which put a very small annual limit on Jews who would be allowed into Palestine, and declared that no more Jewish immigration would be allowed into Palestine within 5 years. So the tragedy is only heightened for the Jews of Europe, who are now denied this particular avenue of escape and are thus under the horrors of the Holocaust, the Nazis carrying out their most evil final solution of the Jewish question. These restrictive British immigration policies continued after World War II, as they had been in place before World War II. The restrictions on Jewish immigration, again, bowing to pressure, shall we say, from the Arab residents of Palestine. The policies were enforced by the turning away of shiploads of now Holocaust survivors who were trying to get into British Mandate Palestine. You may be familiar, I'm sure you are, with the blockbuster novel by Leon Uris and the subsequent film Exodus, which dramatized the plight of one such shipload of Jewish refugees trying to get in to Palestine. The name of their ship was the Exodus. Angered by these restrictions on Jewish immigration, and Jews also demanding independence from Britain, Jewish resistance fighters initiated a violent uprising against British control, assassinating local officials, bombing British outposts, demanding an end to British immigration restrictions, demanding an end to British rule, demanding an independence of a Jewish state of Israel. The largest single loss of life in the Jewish revolt against British authority came in 1946, the year after the war ends, when Jewish rebel forces bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was the administrative headquarters of the British Mandate, killing more than 90 people who were in that British Mandate headquarters building. And one of the leaders of that attack was a man named Menachem Begin, who becomes a future British Israeli prime minister. Well, following the bombing of the King David Hotel the very next year, the United Nations issues a proposal to terminate the British Mandate and to establish an independence for Israel. The United Nations Partition Plan of 1947 to end the British Mandate called for the creation of 2 independent states in the former mandated territory. One would be a Jewish state and one would be an Arab state. Look at these 2 maps. On the left, you see in the dark areas on the left, the areas of Jewish settlement prior to the partition. A minority population spread throughout Palestine. On the right, you see the Jewish territories for the proposed Jewish state to include all of those Jewish settlement areas plus additional territory. And the other state, the Arab state, you see enclosing perhaps about the same amount of territory, maybe a little bit less, but a division between Jews and Arabs, a 2-state solution. And in the middle of the Arab state, the city of Jerusalem was to be under international or United Nations control, an internationally controlled city in the heart of the newly created, or hoped to be created, Arab state. On May 14th, 1948, Israel was born as a modern independent nation. It was the day that the British Mandate ended at midnight, and Israelis celebrate their independence. following day, however, Israel is invaded by its Arab neighbors. Indeed, the invasions are going to come from many directions and are going to continue up until the present time. Invasions and counter-invasions and conflicts and rebellions and counter-rebellions and so on. That has been the history ever since the independence of Israel. Indeed, we have 5 separate major conflicts in the period between the independence of Israel in 1948 and the present time. Just as we happen to have noticed earlier, 5 major conquests between the time of Solomon and Christ. Now we have 5 major conflicts between the independence of Israel and the present moment. The first of those post-independence conflicts is known as the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, or the First Arab-Israeli War. The war began when all of Israel's Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, invaded the new Jewish state. None of these Arab nations recognized Israel's right to exist. They invaded, hoping to wipe the newly created state of Israel off the map. They failed to do so. When the fighting ended after about 7 months, this first Arab-Israeli war left a redistribution of land. If you look at this map here, you'll see the area that was intended to be the Israeli state, and the area that in the sort of grayed area, which was intended to be the Arab state. And at the end of this first Arab-Israeli war, the territory that Israel controlled included much of the land that had been earmarked by the UN partition plan for the independent Arab state. At the war's end, Jordan controlled part of that hoped-for Arab-Palestinian state. They controlled the entire West Bank, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip, which was also to be a part of that independent Palestinian state. Jerusalem, following that first war, became a divided city, with the Israelis governing West Jerusalem and Jordan administering East Jerusalem, the old walled city. Well, with that redistribution of the land, the increase in the size of the Jewish state of Israel, Jewish population increased dramatically. In 1950, the Israeli government adopted a law of return, so-called, which extended to Jews worldwide the right to live in Israel and to become Israeli citizens. Within 4 years, the Jewish population of Israel more than doubled. People enjoyed having the invitation. They had good reason to leave shattered Europe, and so they came in great numbers into the newly independent nation of Israel. Warfare returned to the region in 1956, when the armed forces of Israel, joined by France and Great Britain, attacked Egypt following the Egyptian seizure or nationalization of the Suez Canal. This conflict, number 2, is known in the West as the Suez Crisis. It's known in Egypt and throughout much of the Arab world as the War of Tripartite Aggression, referring to the invasion by Israel, France, and Great Britain. This conflict ended fairly soon when the United States and the Soviet Union put pressure upon the invading forces to withdraw their armies, which they did, and the canal remained under Egyptian control, as it is still today. The third conflict broke out in 1967, and perhaps this is the most significant of them all, the so-called Six-Day War, in which Israel launched a preemptive strike against its neighbors. During a lightning-swift campaign, Israeli forces occupied all of the remaining territories that the UN had hoped to be an independent Arab state. And in addition to that, in addition to taking all of the areas designated by the UN to be an Arab state, The Israeli forces also moved into Syrian territory in the north, seizing the strategic Golan Heights above the Sea of Galilee, and moved also all across the Sinai Peninsula and occupied all of that area as well. With the expansion now of the borders of Israeli control, Israel had administration over 1 million additional Palestinian Arabs. The 6-day with a United Nations resolution, number 242, which is of great importance. And this United Nations Security Council resolution, which was unanimously adopted, called for two primary things. One, the withdrawal of all Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, which would include, again, those Palestinian territories, would include the Golan Heights, would include the Sinai Peninsula. And secondly, and of equal importance, the UN Resolution 242 called upon all of the nations in the region to recognize mutually the right of the other ones to exist, to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. And sadly, we know that neither of these points of the UN Resolution 242 have been fully implemented in the years since the Six-Day War of 1967. After some 6 years of non-withdrawal of their occupation of the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, the fourth conflict broke out, the so-called Yom Kippur War, in which Syria invaded the Golan Heights in the north, trying to reclaim that territory. Egypt invaded the Sinai Peninsula, hoping to regain that territory, and in both cases they failed. The Israeli forces, after 19 days, had expelled the invading armies, and the landscape, the distribution of land, the boundaries were unchanged after the Yom Kippur War. However, perhaps stimulated by this continuing rounds of conflict, and indeed it was stimulated by that very thing, representatives of Egypt and Israel began negotiating. Some 5 years after the Yom Kippur War, the so-called Camp David Accords were signed between Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who you recall had been involved in the bombing of the King David Hotel in the fight against the British, and the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, whom you may recall is later going to be assassinated. And under the watchful gaze and the smiling gaze of President Jimmy Carter, these former enemies signed a historic agreement, the so-called Camp David Accords, in which Israel agreed to withdraw its occupying forces from the Sinai Peninsula, allowing it to return to Egypt, and Egypt, on its part, became the first Arab nation to do so, major nation to do so, extended its diplomatic recognition to Israel, recognizing its right to exist. And as great a step forward as the Camp David Accords was, nevertheless, the issue of the Palestinians remained unresolved. There was still no Arab state in Palestine as envisioned by the UN Partition Plan. The Camp David Accords called for negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians to establish autonomy, or limited autonomy, or independence, or quasi-independence, something, in the West Bank and the Gaza, but little progress, in fact, was made. And so it was, conflict number 5, the Intifada, broke out in 1987. Palestinians, frustrated by the lack of progress in moving towards autonomy, rose up in a grassroots uprising against Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. The Intifada, which is Arabic for brushing off, included strikes and boycotts, as well as acts of violence. Many people killed on both sides of the conflict. Around the world, as the Intifada continued and as Israeli response intensified, public sympathy, I would say, began to shift in many quarters in the Western world, around the world, uh, toward the Palestinians and away from the Israelis. Of course, there was tremendous division of opinion, but I think you could see some shifting of public opinion in the response to the Intifada. Meanwhile, in faraway Norway, in the city of Oslo, even while the violence was continuing in the Middle East, Palestinian and Israeli leaders were reaching agreements, finally, to grant Palestinians some limited autonomy in their territories. Pardon me again. The agreements between Israeli and Palestinian leaders culminated in 1993 when Palestinian Liberation Organization President Yasser Arafat, shown here on the right, and the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, on the left, shook hands on the White House lawn under the watchful gaze of President Bill Clinton. The Oslo Accords created a semi-autonomous Palestinian authority to govern portions of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are shown here in red. Beginning in 1994, the Palestinian Authority, which the Palestinians came to be calling the Palestinian National Authority, assumed responsibility for security and civilian affairs in these various red Palestinian territories. They began issuing postage stamps and engaging in other governmental functions such as monitoring border crossings and, perhaps more importantly, adopting a national flag. The Israelis, however, retained exclusive control over Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank and over all of Jerusalem. The Oslo Accords had expressly forbidden unilateral settlements by either Arabs or Jews, Palestinians or Israelis, to any settlements that would upset the status quo, that whatever was existing under control by Palestinians or Israelis in 1993 was basically to be frozen. No more additional settlements. However, Israeli settlements continued to expand into Palestinian territories, and the Israeli government alternatively, back and forth, either supported that movement or forcibly removed some of those expanding settlements. Meanwhile, as the settlements continued to expand, the Palestinians continued to suffer and witness a loss of land, as is illustrated by these four maps. It was in the 1990s and early 2000s that Israel began building a physical barrier around the Palestinian areas in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, known simply as the Wall. Israeli authorities claimed that the barrier was a defensive measure, and there was good reason to make that argument. Israel had been attacked by Palestinian terrorists, by Palestinian suicide bombers for many years during the Intifada, targeting Israeli cafes, buses, outdoor markets, shopping malls. Many civilian Israelis were killed in those attacks. And once the wall was completed in various areas around the Palestinian territories, the number of suicide bombings, in fact, did decline. So you could make a good argument that the wall accomplished what the Israelis hoped it would by reducing the number of suicide bombing attacks coming from the Palestinian territories into Israeli territories. But opponents of the wall had a good argument as well. They said that it was not just a defensive measure by the Israelis, it really was something of an aggressive measure by the Israelis in that they were consolidating ill-gotten territorial gains, cementing literally in place the territories and additional settlements into lands that, presumably going back to the UN partition plan, would have been for an independent Arab state ruled by now the newly established Palestinian Authority or Palestinian National Authority. Opponents of the wall also argued, with good grounds, that the wall imposed a severe economic hardship on Palestinians, isolating communities and blocking long-standing routes of travel, making life very difficult for Palestinians. Even the name of the wall was contested and remains contested to this day. Israelis tend to call it a security fence or an anti-terrorist fence. Palestinians, on the other hand, commonly refer to it as a racial segregation wall or an apartheid wall. Very different names, very different connotations. On both sides of the Arab-Israeli conflict today are a wide range of opinions and political aspirations. The Palestinian National Authority is dominated by the secular Fatah political party, founded by Yasser Arafat, and that organization continues to administer portions of the West Bank, those dark green areas on the map there on the right. That's under the Palestinian Authority, dominated by this secular Fatah political party founded by Yasser Arafat. But since 2007, the Gaza Strip has been under the de facto rule of Hamas, a rival Islamist Palestinian faction supported by Iran. So two different ruling groups within these two different Palestinian territories. This division among the Palestinians has left the Israelis with a bewildering choice of antagonists, as this cartoon suggests, between Fatah and Hamas. And of course, within Israel, there also are major divisions and differences of opinions and a variety of political parties. The two dominant parties have differing views on how to deal with the Palestinians. The hardline right-wing Likud party is more opposed to the establishment of additional Palestinian authority or eventual independence. The current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the head of the Likud party, the leader of the so-called Likudniks. The other major political party in Israel, of many different parties, is the Labor Party, a more moderate party, and occasionally it is in power, and it takes, I would say, a more conciliatory stance towards Palestinian autonomy and perhaps more encouraging of the so-called peace process, which flows and ebbs according to which party is in power in Israel. Well, you can hear my voice is about to give out, and we come appropriately, perhaps for a moment of silence, with the question how to conclude. What can we say other than this? The prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians remains uncertain at best. In addition to cultural and religious differences, which are very deep, the legacy of violence and distrust continues unabated. The history we've surveyed here in this slog through so much history, that legacy lies very, very heavy on the land, both in Israel and in the Palestine. But I say, it's not hopeless. Think about other deeply divided lands in our own lifetimes that against all odds have moved toward peace and justice. I mean, think of Northern Ireland, how deeply divided that land was between Catholic and Protestant. Think of South Africa, apartheid South Africa, so deeply divided between black and white. And think also of the progress that has been made in our lifetime towards peace and justice and reconciliation. Not perfect by any means, but major progress has been made. So why not in Israel and Palestine? As we reflect on the history of the Holy Land, I think we can begin to gauge for ourselves the possibilities for peace in this land so long conflicted, so often conquered, and so bitterly contested. And as we reflect on that history and realize the depth, the enormity of the challenge that lies before the world and before these peoples, let us commit ourselves to continue to pray and to work for peace. To pray and to work for peace. In the words of Psalm 122, let us pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. For the sake of my relatives and friends, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. Amen.